You want to be clear and concise in your language. And some of this is just good communication, but it is through a servant leadership lens. So servant leadership is about being respectful and courteous in your communication, open and honest, attentive and active listening, and empathy. Empathy is a big part of servant leadership. And just to reiterate our framework between sympathy and empathy, right? So you'll start make it even more straight. So apathy would be, I don't care about your feelings, right? Sympathy would be, I care about your feelings. The old example of like someone sitting in the middle of a hole, like, yeah, I get it. It's terrible to be down there. Whereas empathy is actually crawling in that hole next to them to really understand, to really reflect on a time when I felt that same emotion, and just to be there with them in that moment. That's what empathetic listening would be, is to actually feel the feelings that somebody else is feeling at a time. Okay. All right, empowerment. Once again, this is the number one thing I would say that everyone can do today to change their servant leadership mentality. Number one, do not be afraid to let people fail. This is the hardest thing to do as a leader, is letting people fail. And I always say to young leaders, you know, how did you learn the most growing up? And most of them will say something like, well, the way I learned was through failure. Great. Then why do you deprive the people on your team from that opportunity to learn? Well, I want them to be successful, right? And it's always this trade-off between success in the short term and success in the long term, right? Sometimes success in the short term is going to come at the expense of success in the long term, because we lose some of these little small failures. So empowering is about allowing people to fail in a space where they're safe and they can actually fail and it won't ruin their career. Because I think about how many times I failed in my career, and it hasn't ruined my career. I've made lots of mistakes, but I've learned from them every time. And so as a good servant leader, it's weird to say a big part of a servant leader is stepping back and empowering people and letting them fail. Okay? And then what about your peers and superiors? So leading people is one thing, but a good servant leader should also be good at peers, right? So you want to, of course, be respectful to peers, same as normal, appreciative and and show gratitude, authentic and transparent. But the thing that I always do, and I started this many years ago, even back when I was in the Army, and it's something I carried forward for the rest of my career, is anytime any of my peers or superiors or anybody like that says thank you, right? Anytime they say thank you, my only response to them every single time is one team, right? And what I'm trying to say is, you don't need to thank me, because we're pulling toward the same effort. So it's not a thank you, it's a, hey, it's one team, we're all in this together, we're pulling it together. So better than you're welcome, better than thank you back, I always just answer with one team. So how do you handle conflicts, right? What I'm trying to point out is that you can be a servant leader in all aspects of leadership, from direct supervision, organizational leadership, peer leadership, upwards leadership, but then also conflicts, which is one of the most difficult things we deal with. So of course it's important to be calm, composed, respectful and empathetic. That empathetic word comes back. Flexible and adaptable to the changing, and resilient and optimistic, right? So it's about engaging whatever the conflict is, or if it's a conflict with you directly, first seek to understand what the other person's saying, and then seek to be understood. Servant leadership is not about rolling over. Servant leadership is not about just giving the other person what they want, or just letting the conflict, or just being rolled over in a conflict. It's about listening, being empathetic, but also setting clear boundaries, and making your own point clear. And then how do you evaluate and measure yourself, right? So you can set SMART goals as a leader. You can say, okay, this is how I'm going to empower people, or you can come back to some of our surveys and say, hey, if I do an initial survey that says my servant leadership is at a 2.5 and I want to make it a 4.0 by the end of the year, what behaviors am I going to put in place to change it, right? And that's that quantitative and qualitative data. That's another thing you can do, is just kind of ask people, right? You can say, I've really been working on my empowerment this year. Can you give me some feedback on how you feel? Do you feel empowered? One thing is that word itself has so much strength. The word itself, empowerment's in there, right? So to not be afraid to actually use that word. You got to analyze the data, use the data and feedback. This is one thing that sets us apart as PhD leaders, is that, at the graduate level, at the MBA level, there is some fantastic leadership concepts out there. It's really amazing stuff, but it's all very much at the theoretical and just reasonable level, right? So like I can tell you all day, empowerment makes sense and you'll believe me. But what a PhD researcher does then is takes it to the next level and says, okay, based on all the 7 facets, here are the specific ones that drive the best results based on data and research in various places, right? So that's the empirical difference, the quantitative difference that a PhD level consultant gets you is here's the math behind this idea, behind this research to actually get you to an empirical result and how your behaviors can drive empirical results. Okay, so one last point I'd make is that this is just one of the many modules that we offer as PhD leaders. Another one that I would recommend that fits very well with servant leadership is this concept of culture change. Because it's one thing to say, how am I going to be a servant leader? But it's another thing to say, I want to lead a team of servant leaders. I want to build an organization that's focused on servant leadership. And I'm not saying every culture needs to be servant leadership. That might not be what fits best for you. But we are able to help navigate through that concept of how do I change a culture to more in line with my own personal values. So for example, if it were me and I were starting an organization, I would want a servant leadership organization. And so I would engage somebody to say, how do I create that culture in my organization? Okay. All right, summary of the main points we talked about today. We talked what is leadership? What is the navigating to leadership excellence model of leadership? We talked about the history of servant leadership going back to Jesus all the way through Robert Greenleaf and his modern academic definition of servant leadership. We talked about the subfacets of servant leadership by various researchers. We talked about why servant leadership matters. We gave some historical and fun fictional examples of servant leaders, and then some specific practical ways that you can incorporate servant leadership into your daily activities. Thank you for your time. I am Robert White, and leadership excellence elevates lives, transforms businesses, and enriches your personal journey. Thank you.